Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a city glowing with golden light, columns soaring into the indigo sky, the scent of roasted lamb drifting down narrow alleys, sandals brushing dust off stone as men argue about honor, politics, and the meaning of life. Welcome to ancient Athens, the birthplace of democracy, philosophy, and slavery. Yeah, you probably won't survive this revelation, but let's walk through it gently. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your location and local time in the comments. I love knowing where you're all listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin at the base of the Acropolis. The Parthenon gleams like a wedding cake left out in the sun too long, almost too perfect. It's hard not to feel small beneath it. That temple, dedicated to Athene, radiates wealth, power, and something else. Guilt, maybe. Because while the marble might be quarried from Pentelic slopes, the labor chiseling it smooth came from hands that didn't own themselves. As you walk through the streets of 5th century BC Athens, you notice things. Oil lamps flicker from villas. Wine flows freely from amphorae. There's laughter from a courtyard where citizens recline on couches, draped in clean white chitons. But here's the thing, someone has to keep that wine jug full. Someone swept that courtyard. Someone laundered those chitons with lye and a river rock. That someone is a slave, not an exception, an expectation. Athens at its peak had a population of around 250,000. Of that, barely 30,000 were eligible male citizens. Women couldn't vote. Foreigners, metics, paid taxes but had no political power, and everyone else. Enslaved. Estimates suggest anywhere from 1/3 to half the population were slaves. You do the math. Historians still argue whether Athens had more or fewer slaves than Sparta, or whether Athenian slavery was kinder. But let's be honest, there's not really a gentle way to own a human being. You watch a man whip past on a narrow side street. He's a potter, complaining about taxes, but he's got 3 slaves. One grinding clay, one firing pots, and one delivering finished ware to the market. The irony isn't lost on you. This man shouts about liberty, while his business depends entirely on people who have none. Later, you hear a democratic assembly in full swing on the Pnyx. Thousands of men raising hands, arguing about war, grain prices, justice. It feels electric. You almost believe it. And then you remember you're a woman or a slave or just someone without the right bloodline. So you sit at the edges, invisible. Most Athenians lived on the edges. And yet, the city moves with rhythm. Slaves drive it. They cook, haul, mine, stitch, row, bathe the babies, take the beatings, bury the dead. They don't wear chains all the time. In fact, many wear clean tunics and sandals. That makes it more chilling. Slavery here isn't just brutality, it's mundane, accepted, assumed. You pass a group of boys arguing over heroes from the Iliad. They reenact scenes with wooden swords. One shouts that he's Achilles. The other pouts and says he's Paris. Meanwhile, a slave boy stands quietly, holding their water jug. He's not part of the game. No one asks who he wants to be. There's something almost theatrical about Athens. Everyone plays a role. Citizen, wife, slave. Even in death, the marble grave markers rarely name the enslaved. You see a few funerary steles, carved with images of women reaching toward children, of men gripping staffs, all caught in quiet tragedy. A small girl, maybe 6, leads a dog with a leash carved in stone. No one mentions the nursemaid who likely raised her. She's not in the picture. One quirky detail, Athenians sometimes gave their slaves names like Happy or Lucky. I mean, if irony was a weapon, this city would never need spears. But the paradox goes deeper. Here in the land of logic and debate, you see people twist words to explain slavery away. Some are born to rule, others to serve, says a man in the Stoa. You might recognize him. His student is that barefoot guy with the weird questions, Socrates. Even philosophy can't escape the stain. Still, Athenians see themselves as the freest of people. They praise Eleutheria, liberty, as sacred. But their freedom has a cost. It rests on a silent, exhausted class that doesn't get to speak. And when one of them does whisper back, it's usually through myth, comedy, or tragedy, so you wander into a theater. The chorus dances under moonlight, masks catching shadows. They tell the story of a king, or a god, or a fool. And sometimes, just sometimes, a slave character gets the last laugh. A little jab at their master, a wink to the audience. Everyone laughs. Then they go home and beat their servant for serving dinner cold. The lights of the city dim as you walk back uphill. The stones under your feet are warm from the day. Cicadas hum. Someone's weeping softly in an alley, maybe drunk, maybe hurt, maybe both. You pass them, and you realize. This city's greatness, its marble glow, its celebrated freedom, it's not a lie exactly. It's just built on top of a silence so loud you had to come here to hear it. You wake up the next morning in the hum of Athens, daily noise, donkeys braying, clay jars clinking, some guy already yelling about olive oil prices. The city is buzzing. You wander through the streets, half asleep, but wide-eyed because today you're heading to the heart of this so-called democracy, the Pnyx. It's not much to look at, really. Just a sloped hillside with rough stone seating and a speaker's platform. But this dusty rise holds the power to decide wars, exile enemies, and shape laws that will ripple through centuries. You're expecting grandeur. Instead, you get a crowd of sweaty men, swatting flies and shouting over each other. This is democracy, baby. But before you get carried away romanticizing this ancient town hall, check your status. You're not getting in, not really. Because only male citizens over the age of 18, born to Athenian parents, can vote here. That's it. That's the whole club. Women? Nope. Foreigners? Nada. Slaves? Not unless the gods start rewriting biology. So while historians still argue whether the Athenian citizenry numbered closer to 30,000 or 60,000 at its height, one thing is clear. The vast majority of people in Athens were excluded from direct political life. You're more likely to be serving snacks at the meeting than speaking at it. Even among those equals, there's a pecking order. Wealthier men have more influence. They arrive early, take the best seats, and dominate the debates. Poorer citizens often show up late after working in the fields, or they're paid a small stipend to attend, a clever way to keep the laboring class from skipping their civic duty. There's something strange about watching men argue passionately about freedom while relying on slave-run farms to give them time to do so. Down in the agora, the public marketplace, the lines blur even more. Political discussions spill out between booths selling figs and fish. Some guy from the Deme of Achani is ranting about military policy, while his slave quietly barters for onions behind him. The citizen complains that Athens is too corrupt, too soft on crime, right before he orders his enslaved boy to polish his sandals again. There's a fringe theory, one some scholars still debate, that Athenian democracy evolved because of slavery. Not in spite of it. Think about it. If you've got an invisible class handling your food, laundry, errands, and mining your silver, you've got time to think about justice and law. Leisure isn't just a perk, it's the foundation. Democracy rides in a chariot pulled by slaves. Of course, the Athenians never frame it like that. To them, being a citizen is a sacred gift. It's about autonomy, the right to speak your mind, to vote, to challenge power. But that autonomy is carefully ring-fenced. It's a members-only benefit, and the entry fee is your birth certificate. You overhear one man scold another. You speak as if you were a slave. It's an insult. Not because slaves are incapable of thought, but because their thoughts don't count. Legally, they're property. They can be tortured for testimony because it's assumed slaves always lie unless beaten. That's in the courtroom playbook. Seriously. You pass a small shrine to Hermes, patron of travelers and thieves. It's covered in garlands. A slave kneels there, lips moving silently in prayer. He probably won't get divine intervention, but it's something. There's no law against enslaved people worshipping, but they don't exactly get festival days off. Still, the streets thrum with this strange paradox. A city obsessed with equality, built on inequality. A society praising rational debate while forcibly silencing the majority. And yet, it works. Athens becomes a military power, a cultural titan. Plays, poems, political ideas all flourish. But the structure holding it up is unequal by design. You grab a seat near the back of the pnyx, blending in. Today's debate is about a grain shipment from Sicily. One speaker wants to raise tariffs. Another warns it'll provoke war. You watch the crowd murmur, nod, shout. A man tosses a fig at a speaker he doesn't like. Democracy is messy, loud, kind of hilarious, and deeply flawed. Nearby, a slave fans his master with a palm frond. The man waves him off mid-sentence. "Go wait by the mule," he says, not even breaking eye contact with the speaker. The slave walks away without a word. The system is full of contradictions. A citizen who votes for peace but beats his slaves. A philosopher who preaches virtue but pays for human labor. A playwright who mocks tyranny but owns house staff. And here's a quirky little wrinkle. Sometimes slaves sneak into assembly meetings. Not to speak, heavens no, but to listen. To learn what's coming, because knowledge is currency. If you're a slave working in a bureaucrat's home and you catch wind of a tax reform, that's something you might whisper to another household in exchange for better food or protection or a rare day off. This undercurrent of quiet awareness runs through Athens like an underground stream. The enslaved population knows far more than they're given credit for. They learn languages. They pick up politics. They memorize the habits and secrets of their masters. Some even learn to read and write. It's dangerous, but not impossible. And sometimes, rarely, a slave is freed, not often. But manumission happens if a master dies kindly or if a slave saves enough to buy their freedom. Even then, they don't become citizens. They become metics, free, taxed, and still shut out from politics. Basically, congratulations, you're now a second-class non-slave. As the sun dips low, the assembly breaks up. The men file out, still arguing. Some look smug, some bored. One slips on a grape and curses like a sailor. Typical. You wander back toward the agora, past a wall plastered with decrees. New taxes, public festivals, court summons, all written in clear, sharp lettering, and yet half the city can't read them. In a town famous for talking, for thinking, for voting, you realize the loudest voices are not necessarily the most important. The most necessary hands are not on the ballots, and the most vital workers never get to vote for the world they build. You're up before dawn, trailing a group of men in dusty cloaks, some still rubbing sleep from their eyes. They're headed to the agora again, but this time it's not for voting or shopping, it's for a court case. And no, it's not a juicy murder trial or a stolen goat. It's about land. Specifically, whether this man's estate rightfully belongs to him or should be redistributed. Sounds noble, right? A city trying to balance the scales. Well, not so fast. This scene is one ripple from the legal and political reforms of two famous names you've probably heard in high school lectures. Solon and Cleisthenes, two so-called fathers of democracy. Big names on the Athenian history wall. But as you watch this legal drama unfold, you realize something uncomfortable. These reforms weren't designed to lift everyone. They were designed to rescue citizens from becoming slaves themselves. You see, back in the 6th century BCE, before all the golden glory, Athens was messy. The rich were gobbling up land. The poor were being crushed by debt. And in a particularly charming local custom, if you owed more than you could pay, you could be enslaved by your fellow citizen. It wasn't a foreign invader. It wasn't war. It was your neighbor Gregor slapping iron on your wrists because you missed a payment. Try explaining that at the neighborhood barbecue. So Solon, poet, politician, problem solver, comes along and says, "All right, this is getting out of hand." His famous Sasachtheia, or shaking off of burdens, cancels debts, bans debt slavery for citizens, and reforms class privileges. Suddenly, Athenian citizens can't enslave each other anymore. Sounds great, right? Until you realize the ripple effect. See, this means that slaves now have to come from somewhere else. Foreigners, prisoners of war, kids born into bondage. Athens doesn't abolish slavery, it internationalizes it. Historians still argue whether Solon meant to create a fairer society, or just one that ran more efficiently without civil war. Either way, his reforms solidify slavery's role by drawing a line in the sand. We won't enslave our own, but everyone else. Fair game. Then comes Cleisthenes, about a century later. He restructures the citizen body, breaks up aristocratic power blocks, and establishes the 10 tribes. More equality, more representation, but again, only for male citizens. The machinery of democracy is taking shape. But like any machine, it needs fuel. And you already know where that fuel comes from, the enslaved. Now here's a quirky twist. One of Cleisthenes' innovations was the ostracism vote. Once a year, citizens could vote to banish someone from Athens for 10 years. No crime required. Just vibes. Picture that today. Who are we sick of? Steve? Yeah, get him out of here. Boom, 10 years of exile. And who tallied those votes? Who carried the ostraka, the little pottery shards with names scratched into them? Who kept the city clean while the demos argued about who to kick out? You guessed it. So while Cleisthenes rebuilt the democratic system, slaves were its invisible scaffolding. They fetched water for jurors, cleaned up after rowdy assemblies, and kept the streets safe enough for citizens to stroll around philosophizing. Even the judicial system depended on slaves. You see one now, standing near a water clock, a clepsydra used to time speeches in court. He's silent, watching the water drip, measuring out justice one slow second at a time. He doesn't get to argue in court, but he's essential to the process. You pass another man dictating a legal complaint to a scribe, sometimes a metic, but often an enslaved expert. Writing is a professional skill, and few citizens bother to learn it deeply. Why should they, when they can just own someone who's literate? This is Athens' big contradiction. It creates equality by outsourcing inequality. Reforms protect citizens from being sold, but then turn around and double down on importing labor to pick up the slack. And because so many citizens are now freed from grunt work, they can participate in politics, philosophy, and war. It's like a civic pyramid scheme. The ones at the top preach liberty because they don't have to carry anything anymore. A fun little irony. At this moment, there's a play being written by Euripides, where a noble-born character becomes a slave and learns humility. Audiences love these morality tales. They cry, they applaud, and then they walk home past real slaves carrying props back to the playwright's house. You turn a corner and spot a public fountain house, the Eni Kraunos, where women and slaves gather water daily. It's crowded. A young slave girl, no older than 10, struggles to carry a jug twice her size. She slips, water sloshes onto the flagstones, and a passerby yells at her like she's spilled his inheritance. No one helps her. You start to notice how the entire city is designed around this dual structure. Grand buildings, slave-built, daily bread, slave ground, public officials, freed up by invisible labor. Even the festivals, like the Parthenon, are full of rituals that depend on enslaved musicians, tailors, cooks, and porters. While citizens parade in honor of Athene, slaves clean up the mess behind them. And here's the philosophical gut punch. For the system to work, most Athenians had to accept the humanity of some while denying it in others. They had to believe that their liberty was more important than someone else's. Some probably never questioned it. Others, maybe, lay awake at night wondering if the gods really saw any difference between master and slave. But the system never stopped. Not for guilt, not for logic, not even for love. You pass a quiet stone stele on a side street. It bears the name of a woman, unusual in itself. Below her name is a line in faded script, too soft to make out fully. A scholar nearby tells you it's a rare mention of a freedwoman, once a nurse in a wealthy household. Her master left her a small sum when he died. No one visits the grave. As the sun slides low again, casting long shadows across the marble streets, you realize something. The reforms that supposedly made Athens great didn't challenge slavery. They depended on it. They polished the surface, while sinking the foundations deeper into blood and silence. You follow the morning crowd into the heart of the agora, and this time, you're not just watching politics, you're watching commerce. Fruit vendors bellow prices, bakers slap fresh loaves on the counter, and bronze tools glint in the sunlight. There's movement everywhere, sandals shuffling, coins clinking, goats refusing to cooperate. The whole city seems to pulse with purpose. But as your eyes adjust, you begin to notice the quieter gears turning beneath the chaos. A hunched man in rags unloads amphorae from a cart. A teenage girl lifts a basket of figs onto her head. A boy sweeps olive pits off the stone path, avoiding eye contact with the men arguing above him. These aren't merchants. They aren't customers. They're the invisible labor behind every polished transaction. This is Athens, marketplace of ideas, sure, but it's also a marketplace of bodies, not just economically, but literally. Because in certain corners of the agora, people are being bought and sold. Yup, the city of Socrates and Sophocles runs a thriving slave market, and you almost missed it. It's not flashy, no auction blocks. But if you follow the right path, past the cobblers and the dice games, you'll hear low voices and see careful inspections, teeth, backs, calloused hands. It's not a spectacle, it's just normal. Most of these people have no papers, no last names, just stories, and not always true ones. Some claim noble birth, lost to pirates or politics. Others were born into bondage and know nothing else. Sometimes they're dressed neatly to fetch a better price. Sometimes they're still in chains. Historians still argue how much of the agora's slave trade was centralized versus informal. But what's clear is that everyone here depends on it. From the guy selling fish to the woman grinding flour, they all need labor. Cheap, constant, replaceable labor. And slavery in Athens isn't just about fields and homes. It's embedded into the city's infrastructure. Every column, every drainage ditch, every polished floor tile. They don't come from citizen hands. You duck into a workshop where a potter and his slaves are hard at work. The master draws designs with a confident flick of the wrist, while a boy silently turns the wheel. Another tends the fire, sweat rolling off his nose. They've done this 1,000 times. The rhythm is almost musical. One pot, a red figure crater, depicts a symposium, men reclining, drinking, laughing. But in the corner of the design is a small, hunched figure pouring wine, a slave barely visible. It's art imitating life, or maybe mocking it. You step outside and pass a tanner's stall. The smell hits first, acrid, sour, unforgettable. A man stirs hides in a vat of urine used to soften the leather. He's soaked to the knees. You know instantly he's a slave. No citizen would take this job. Quirky fact. Ancient Athenians actually paid public slaves to serve as sanitation workers. Some cleaned latrines. Others walked the streets collecting, well, what goats and dogs leave behind. And if someone died in public and no family claimed the body, slaves buried them. So much for democracy's dignity. As you follow a group of house slaves returning from errands, you see how they move like ghosts, quick, quiet, heads down. One carries a bolt of wool, another a jar of honey. They're walking past dozens of citizens, but no one greets them. And yet, their work fuels every part of this economy. Enslaved weavers make the city's famed textiles. Enslaved smiths repair weapons. Enslaved cooks prepare sacrificial meals. Even the oil that lights lamps in homes and temples is pressed by slave hands. There's a debate among scholars about just how specialized some Athenian slaves were. Some became highly trained artisans, stonecutters, goldsmiths, musicians. Their skills gave them more mobility, sometimes even enough savings to buy freedom. But even then, the city never let them forget what they were. A merchant brushes past you, muttering about needing to replace a lazy Thracian girl. His words sting more than he intends, like she's a broken tool, not a person. You wonder what her life looked like. Was she working at a loom, nursing a child not her own? Or maybe she's the one you saw earlier, eyes fixed on the ground as she carried grapes to market. You pause at a public notice board. Scribbled graffiti around it catches your eye. One crude drawing shows a fat man riding a smaller, stick-figure person like a donkey. It's a joke, but also a truth everyone pretends not to see. Even religion doesn't offer much escape. Sacrifices in the agora require spotless altars, sharpened knives, and carefully prepared animals, all tended by enslaved workers. The sacred and the profane blur constantly here. A citizen passes by, talking proudly to his son about the glories of the city. The boy nods, eyes wide, then turns and throws a pebble at a slave sweeping nearby. No one says a word. You walk past a small booth where a man is reading aloud from a scroll, some new law about property rights. A few listeners nod, but one slave leans in, subtly from the edge. He can't vote, he can't own land, but knowledge. He can still steal that if he's careful. That's the secret undercurrent of this place, awareness. The slaves know how the city runs because they run it, and they know that everyone's freedom here is measured by someone else's silence. As the sun arcs high and shadows shrink, you duck into the shade of a colonnade. The stones under your feet are smooth from centuries of footsteps. Citizens, yes, but also slaves, especially slaves. They walked farther, carried more. Bled into the gaps between those flagstones. The agora quiets as people retreat for midday rest. You linger, watching two enslaved boys wash the steps of a shrine. One hums softly. The other scrubs harder, maybe hoping the gods are watching. But deep down, you both know they probably are. You're standing in the threshold of a polished Athenian courtyard, sunlight spilling over the marble tiles like warm honey. A breeze sways the fig trees just enough to rustle their leaves, and somewhere nearby, a lyre plucks a lazy tune. At first glance, it's tranquil, domestic, even enviable. But then you look closer, at the shadows moving behind the columns, the footsteps that never get to rest. This isn't just someone's home, it's a workplace, and for many, it's a prison. Inside, a woman reclines on a wooden couch, her handmaiden gently braiding her hair. The woman is young, maybe 20, wrapped in soft linen. The slave behind her is even younger. She's silent, steady, and invisible. You get the feeling she's done this 100 times and never once been asked her opinion on a hairstyle. Welcome to the domestic sphere of ancient Athens, where slavery was as intimate as it was relentless. Contrary to popular imagery, most Athenian homes weren't marble palaces. They were modest two-story houses, their outer walls plain and windowless. Privacy mattered here, but not for everyone. Male citizens came and went freely. Their wives were largely confined to the oikos, the household, alongside children, elderly parents, and slaves. Lots of slaves. Some houses had dozens of enslaved people, depending on wealth. There were cooks, wet nurses, nannies, cleaners, seamstresses, porters. One man wrote proudly that his home functioned as a city within itself, and you can't help but wonder how many people he owned to make that boast possible. One mainstream fact: household slaves vastly outnumbered agricultural ones in urban Athens. While Spartan slaves, helots, were mostly field workers, Athenians integrated enslaved people directly into their homes. Close quarters, constant labor, no escape. You peer into the kitchen, and it's a flurry of movement. A boy stirs a pot of lentils while a girl kneads dough beside him. Another empties a chamber pot with a grimace that's become habit. None of them speaks unless spoken to. Their silence is part of the furniture, and that's the thing, it's not just the work. It's the constant, suffocating awareness of being owned. Every task, every moment, is performed under the weight of another's will. You never choose your rest. You never decide your day. There's a fringe tidbit that ancient Athenians believed a good household ran itself, which really meant the slaves had become so disciplined, so trained, that their labor required no orders. That's not efficiency, that's conditioning. You pass a bedroom where a young woman is teaching her son to read. His tutor, a slave called a pedagogos, stands behind him like a shadow. This man will walk the boy to school, supervise him in the gymnasium, and ensure he memorizes Homer. But he'll never teach his own children, if he's even allowed to have them. Historians still argue whether domestic slaves in Athens were better off than those in mines or on farms. Some say yes, they had shelter, food, even emotional bonds with the families they served. But others point out the cruelty of proximity without agency. You're trusted to cradle a child, but you can't hold your own. You duck into a small, cool storeroom where an old woman folds linen. Her fingers are knotted with arthritis. She's been doing this for decades. She was probably given as a dowry when the lady of the house got married. Slaves often were. Part of the furniture, part of the gift. Imagine giving your daughter a human being as a wedding present. She sews beautifully, they'd say, like she's a loom. There are whispers, rare but haunting, of sexual exploitation in these homes, particularly of young enslaved girls. It's not recorded in grand marble inscriptions, but in the quiet hints of comedy, court cases, and gossip. Officially, abuse was frowned upon, but there were no real protections. Power writes the rules, and when power lives in your house, it can't be escaped. One disturbing fact: slaves couldn't marry. They could form relationships, yes, sometimes with other enslaved people, sometimes even with citizens. But there was no legal recognition, no protection. Your partner could be sold at any moment. Your children, not yours, they belonged to your master. Still, somehow, love found ways to bloom. You imagine two slaves whispering in the pantry at night, fingers brushing beneath the olive baskets. A secret smile, a quiet rebellion. It's not in the textbooks, but it must have happened. You walk past a loom where three girls are spinning wool. They hum an old tune, maybe something from their homeland. Many Athenian slaves were foreign-born, taken in war or sold across the Aegean. One girl looks up at you, eyes sharp. She's not broken, just waiting. In some households, slaves served as confidants, even caretakers for their masters in old age. There's a story about a wealthy man leaving part of his estate to a trusted slave, an unusual but not unheard of act. It hints at complicated bonds forged in uneven soil, but those moments don't undo the cruelty. Later, you pass a courtyard where a woman is scolding her maid for dropping a jug. Her voice is sharp, accusing. The slave flinches, not at the words, but at the silence that follows, because next comes punishment, and it won't be public. It'll be private, just like her whole life has been. And here's a quirky image for you. Some Athenian households had a door slave, a doorman who sat outside, sometimes chained, to prevent other slaves from escaping. A literal human lock. That's the world you're in. One where slaves prepare the food but don't eat with the family. Where they cradle the babies but are dismissed before dinner. Where their work is seen as natural, their presence as background, and their absence as disaster. As dusk falls, the house fills with the sounds of evening. The chopping of herbs, the splash of water, the low murmur of lullabies. You stand in a doorway watching a slave girl tuck in the children of her master. She sings to them in a soft voice, her accent still touched with the sound of another place. Then she leaves quietly, slipping back into the shadows because her day is not over. It never really is. And you realize, as the house quiets around you, that this democracy, this city of thinkers and orators, was built not just on backs, but in bedrooms and kitchens and laundry rooms, on the labor of those who never got to speak. The morning air is cool, and the smell of burning wood lingers faintly as you walk farther from the heart of Athens. The marble fades into packed earth. The gossip of the agora disappears behind you. Ahead, the hills rise, barren and dry, like cracked knuckles under the sky. You're headed to Lorien. The sun creeps higher as you trudge up the rocky trail, joining a stream of wagons creaking under sacks of ore. Drivers mutter, oxen grunt, and up ahead, a wiry boy stumbles and gets a barked order in return. His tunic is torn, his feet are bare, his face expressionless. You've reached the silver mines. Lorien is not a secret. Athenians boast about it. The wealth from these hills funds temples, fleets, wars, and festivals. Without Lorien, there's no golden age. Without Lorien, there is no democracy. But you're about to see what that silver actually costs. The mouth of the mine yawns like a broken tooth in the rock. You descend behind a group of children, all no older than 12, their shoulders hunched under sacks of tools. It gets darker with each step, and the air shifts, thicker, damper, tainted with something metallic. You can't help but duck, even though the shaft ceiling is barely 5 feet high. The tunnels are carved with crude picks and sweat. This is not Roman engineering. This is scraping, gouging, clawing for treasure with hands and desperation. The deeper you go, the worse it gets. Heat builds, breathing is harder, the walls drip. You hear coughing echo from farther in. Not once, not twice, constant. Shallow, dry, rattling, it's the mine's soundtrack. And the laborers, all slaves, mostly children and young men, many from Thrace or Asia Minor. Some were captured in war, others sold by desperate families. Some were born into this, never seeing the sun except in slivers. One mainstream historical fact, at its peak, thousands of slaves worked these mines. The silver extracted here didn't just pad Athenian pockets, it paid for the very fleet that defeated Persia at Salamis. That naval victory, built on lungs filled with silver dust. You pass a group chipping away at a vein, their arms rhythmic, eyes hollow. A boy near the back slumps against the wall. He's barely moving. A foreman whips past. An overseer, likely a slave himself but ranked higher, shakes the boy, curses, drags him out by the arm. You don't see where they go. Historians still argue whether working in Lorien was a death sentence or just another cog in Athens' economy. But let's be honest, you don't need a debate to understand that 12 hours in darkness, breathing metal and swinging tools is not freedom adjacent. And here's a fringe tidbit. Some Athenians rented out their slaves to the mines. That's right, if you were a citizen with an extra body or two, you could lease them to the state for mining. The slave did the work, you got the pay. A profit model built on someone else's shortened lifespan. You find a narrow chamber where water is pooled, stagnant and dark. Two boys are hauling buckets to keep the tunnel dry. Their hands are blistered. They don't speak. It's not just that they're tired, it's that they've learned silence is safer. Farther in, you spot a makeshift shrine, a scrap of cloth tied to a rock, a few bones arranged in a pattern. Someone, maybe yesterday, maybe a year ago, whispered a prayer down here. It's all they could offer. The Athenians above talk about Eleutheria, freedom, as their national virtue, but they never ask who sweated for the coin they toss in taverns. They never taste the metal on their tongues when they bite into wealth. Back on the surface, the smelting workshops are another hell. You cover your nose instinctively, the fumes of lead and ash punch like a wall. Slaves feed the kilns with ore and wood, their skins smeared with soot. The fire roars constantly. So do the masters. You notice something eerie. None of the workers make eye contact. Not with each other, not with the overseers, not with you. It's like they've unlearned the act of being seen. One man, older, maybe 30, pauses briefly to stretch his back. The master shouts. He hurries back to the furnace. 30 is ancient down here. Few make it that long. You watch molten silver pour from a mold, glowing like captured moonlight. It hardens, cools, and becomes drachmas, coins that will go to build warships, coins that will pay jurors and politicians, coins that will be dropped casually in a temple offering bowl while prayers float upward, coins that came from here. Athenians often prided themselves on not relying on tribute alone. We have our own silver, they'd boast, but they never mentioned that their own meant somebody else's suffering. There's even a comedy, lost to time but quoted in fragments, where a character jokes that the gods must have gold mines in heaven. The line gets a laugh, but down here you realize it was never funny. Eventually you leave the mine. You emerge into sunlight blinking, dirty, dizzy, but the workers don't follow. Most will die here, some within weeks, some within years, all of them for a city that will carve their achievements into stone, but not their names. As you make your way back to the city, you pass wagons heading toward Laurion. More boys, one girl no older than 10. No one explains where they're going. They know, and they go anyway. Because in Athens, your freedom is someone else's grave. And in these hills, they're still digging. You return to Athens at nightfall. The torches flicker across the rooftops, casting long, golden shadows over a city that looks peaceful, almost serene. But now that you've seen what fuels it, it all feels a little haunted. As you walk the streets, you notice something curious. Groups of slaves, some carrying baskets, some trailing behind their masters, aren't chained. They're not even guarded. They move freely, even at night. And here's where things get weird. Because in Athens, unlike many ancient societies, slaves could walk the streets unsupervised. No collars, no marks, no shackles. You might mistake them for free men if you didn't know better. And sometimes, even Athenians couldn't tell the difference. It's one of those quirky truths that baffles historians. Why would a society so reliant on slavery allow so much mobility? Why not keep enslaved people locked up or constantly monitored? Why let them blend into the crowd? Some scholars argue it was strategic. By avoiding overt symbols of bondage, Athens reduced the chances of resistance. If a slave feels a little more free, they might be less likely to rebel, smart in a sinister kind of way. Others believe it was cultural. Athenians valued a clean aesthetic. No chains, no cages. Just obedience polished into routine. Brutality wasn't always about spectacle here, it was about invisibility. But here's the rub. This freedom of movement didn't come with real autonomy. A slave walking to the market might still be punished if they were seen loitering. They could be stopped, questioned, struck. And in one of the most surreal institutions in Athens, they could be publicly policed by other slaves. Yes, you heard that right. Enter the Scythian archers, a group of public slaves tasked with enforcing order during civic gatherings. Armed with bows, they rarely used, and whips, they used plenty. They maintained crowd control during assemblies, escorted defendants to court, and kept things from getting too rowdy. Imagine that, a slave dragging a drunken citizen out of a meeting for disorderly conduct. It happened all the time. You see them now, tall hats, foreign accents, distinct clothing. There's a weird tension in watching a group of enslaved men boss around free Athenians. It flips the script, sort of. Because at the end of the day, they still report to the city. They just enforce rules they didn't help write. The archers were trained, paid, uniformed, almost like a proto-police force. But they had no rights of their own. They could arrest a philosopher for disturbing the peace, then go home to sleep on the floor of a barracks and eat whatever hadn't spoiled. Historians still argue whether the archers had any path to freedom. Some suggest long service might earn a reward. Others say they were a permanent underclass, kept visible and foreign to avoid sympathy. You pass by one now, standing straight as a statue outside the Bouleuterion. He's young, maybe 17. His eyes scan the crowd. No one meets them. The irony is painful. A man tasked with upholding order, but denied any share in the justice he protects. And it doesn't stop there. You start noticing other spaces where enslaved people fill roles of strange authority. Take the mint, where Athens strikes its silver drachmas. Slaves work the furnaces and dyes, but also sometimes supervise coin quality, a skilled job, trusted but not respected. Or the tax offices, where enslaved clerks record grain shipments, estate values, even jury payments. Literate, precise, reliable, and yet never compensated with freedom. One especially odd case. A slave named Parthenon, originally a banker's clerk, eventually became so essential he was freed and made a citizen. A banker, once enslaved, climbing into elite society. But don't get too hopeful, it was rare. Exception, not rule. He made his masters rich before they gave him a sliver of their world. You walk into a small shrine tucked between two homes. It's a quiet space, just a candle flickering before a statue of Hecate. A slave kneels here, praying. You've seen this before, but this time something's different. He's whispering, not for mercy, but for escape. Because not all slaves in Athens stayed put. There are stories of runaways, of those who vanished into the city's sprawl or fled to the hills. The penalty for being caught, severe, whipping, branding, maybe worse. But the fact that they tried means something. It means they dreamed. Quirky detail. Athens had an entire legal process where a slave could seek sanctuary at a temple if they were abused. Not freedom, but protection. Temporary, conditional, like a pause button on cruelty. And yet for most, running wasn't an option. Not because of chains, but because of language, accent, skin, knowledge. The city's walls were high, but the real trap was knowing that no one on the other side was waiting to welcome you. You find a courtyard where two slaves are sharpening tools. One pauses and glances at the street beyond the gate. Just a second, then he turns back to his work. It's in these small moments, these glances, hesitations, lingering prayers, that you see the truth of Athenian slavery. It wasn't always whips and shouting. It was the erosion of choice. The suffocating quiet. The sense that the city doesn't need to beat you because it has already erased the idea that you could ever leave. As the torchlights dance across the city walls, you hear a lyre drifting from a symposium nearby. Laughter. Wine, philosophers making bad puns. They toast to freedom again. And somewhere, in the shadows, the men who keep them safe, fed, and sober wait for morning. The morning sun stretches golden fingers across the rooftops as you wander toward the gymnasium. This is where young Athenian men, citizens in training, learn to wrestle, race, discuss, and let's be honest, show off their perfectly oiled muscles while arguing about virtue. It's a place of beauty and brains, where physical training and philosophy meet under the open sky. A sculpted vision of balance, harmony, civic excellence, and of course, it's also supported, quietly, invisibly, by slaves. You hang back near the entrance, watching as lithe bodies spar in the sand. A group of teenagers debate the ethics of revenge, while another performs stretches that make a yoga instructor weep. But look closer. Behind the elegance, behind the intellectual heat and glistening torsos, something else moves. A figure collects towels. Another pours oil into a shallow dish. One scrubs sweat from the marble benches with a cloth so worn it's practically see-through. None of them participate, they serve. In every gymnasium and training field in Athens, enslaved attendants, called paidotribai and elates, handle the day-to-day business. They mix the perfumes, they clean the equipment. They tend to injuries, and if needed, act as human shock absorbers when a noble youth loses his temper mid-match. The job sounds almost domestic, until you realize these slaves are often assigned to barely clothed teenage boys. The line between mentorship, care, and coercion, paper-thin. Historians still argue whether these gym slaves were simply athletic aides or silent facilitators of more troubling customs. We know relationships between older male citizens and younger boys, Erastes and Eromenos, were socially structured, even idealized. But where did that leave the slaves who watched it all? A fringe detail rarely mentioned in textbooks. Sometimes the elates were expected to apply oil and dust by hand, prepping citizen bodies for exercise. It was part ritual, part grooming, and it gave them a front-row seat to the absurd collision of high ideals and base instincts. You trail one such slave as he carries a tray of fig cakes for the afternoon rest. His steps are practiced, eyes low. He glances once, only once, at the track where boys sprint in the sun, their laughter echoing like the clatter of dice. He used to run like that maybe once before. Just outside the gymnasium, you find a circle of philosophers under a tree mid-debate. One quotes Socrates, another argues Plato is too soft. A third insists the soul is a chariot pulled by two horses, one noble, one wild. You try not to picture the silver mine again. Slaves are present here too, holding scrolls, fetching water, writing notes. These aren't just laborers, they're literate, disciplined, deeply familiar with every argument on the marble benches. But no one asks them what they think. Their hands are useful, their minds inconvenient. One man in the group raises a question: what is freedom, if not self-mastery? Everyone nods solemnly. No one gestures to the man handing him his ink jar. You walk away before you gag on irony. Athens prided itself on paideia, a form of holistic education, training citizens to be well-rounded, morally upright, civically engaged. But paideia only worked because slaves absorbed all the labor that would otherwise clutter a boy's schedule. You couldn't become a citizen hero if you had to wash your own tunic or knead your own bread. Every recitation of Homer came courtesy of someone chopping onions in the next room. Take the symphony of a young aristocrat's life. Sunrise tutoring in mathematics, sword drills in the gym, flute practice in the courtyard. Elegant, elevated, but each moment choreographed by the slaves who prepared the food, sharpened the blades, and fetched the instrument. Some slaves were tutors themselves, highly educated foreigners, sometimes from conquered lands where Greek was spoken fluently. They taught grammar, music, ethics. In some homes, the enslaved tutor was better educated than the master. One such man, a Thracian named Zopyros, became so well known for his teachings that he was quoted, anonymously, of course, by Athenian scholars. Imagine shaping the minds of the elite while knowing your own name wasn't worth ink. You pause outside a wrestling ring as an older coach praises a boy for mastery of his impulses. The boy beams. Moments later, he casually flicks a date pit at a slave passing by. The pit hits the man's cheek. No apology follows. This is Athenian education, the appearance of virtue, balanced atop the shoulders of the invisible. Later in the day, you pass a procession of citizens headed to a public lecture. A famous orator is speaking on justice, dike, and the moral obligations of the polis. You follow, curious. The crowd gathers in an open space, seated in rows, backs straight, sandals neatly tucked beneath robes. Behind them, a cluster of enslaved scribes, recorders, and torchbearers. Their presence is necessary, their participation is not. The speaker's voice rises. Justice is when each man knows his place and fulfills his purpose in the city. Let the slaves remain silent. That phrase haunts you, knows his place. It's repeated often in Athenian thought. Harmony through hierarchy, peace through control. But who decides those places? Who benefits from this tidy ladder of status? One man's golden youth is another's unending servitude. One child learns Plato by candlelight, another holds the candle. As twilight approaches, you return briefly to the gymnasium. The boys are gone. The space is quiet now, just the rustle of trees and the crunch of sand under tired feet. Two slaves are folding benches and gathering amphorae. One pauses, wiping his brow. The other stares up at the stars. They don't say much, but they've seen everything. the glories of youth, the cruelty of teachers, the lessons about justice that apply to everyone except them. And yet, somewhere in that silence, there's memory, resistance, maybe even wisdom. Because when you carry knowledge for others long enough, part of it becomes your own. You walk away from the gymnasium knowing this: Athens may have been the school of Greece, but its classrooms were staffed by shadows. The torchlight wobbles against the stone walls as you descend into a crowded hallway. It smells of dust, sweat, and something metallic, like spilled wine left too long in a cup. You've entered the Dikasterion, Athens' massive citizen courtroom, where justice is served in public, loudly, often messily, and surprise, not without help from the people no one wants to mention. That's right. Even here, in the birthplace of democracy's legal system, slaves are part of the engine. You squeeze into a corner as the jurors file in, hundreds of men, all over 30, randomly selected, paid a modest daily wage. They carry wooden tickets, check their names against the official list, then get seated on stone benches. No lawyers, no judges, just orators, witnesses, and the noise of democracy grinding forward. And behind it all, a quiet constellation of enslaved labor. Take a breath. You're about to see how Athens does court. It's not a solemn affair, it's almost theatrical. Plaintiffs shout, defendants cry, spectators whisper. And hovering at the edges, like stagehands in a badly written play, are the ones who make it all function. The first thing you notice: the clerks are slaves. They manage documents, unroll scrolls, measure speaking times with water clocks called clepsydras. Without them, nothing starts, nothing ends, and no one knows whose turn it is. You watch one boy lower a copper ladle into the clepsydra's reservoir, carefully watching the drip. He never speaks, just listens, measures, resets. A whole legal proceeding balanced on his unacknowledged rhythm. Mainstream fact: most public scribes and secretaries in Athenian courts were state-owned slaves, trained, disciplined, and functionally essential. But despite their importance, they had no voice in the courtroom outcomes. They were the spine, but never the voice. The trial today, it's a property dispute, two brothers fighting over an inheritance. Emotions run high. The plaintiff swears on Apollo. The defendant invokes the dead father. Somewhere in the crowd, a group of women sob. Everyone's leaning forward, except the two slaves beside the podium, one holding a wax tablet, the other managing the clepsydra. They've heard it all before: murder, theft, slander, adultery. It all blurs together when your job is to hold the ink and measure time. Fringe tidbit: some slaves in the legal system were so respected for their accuracy that citizens bribed them for favorable recording or document placement. That's right, being indispensable doesn't always mean being invisible. Sometimes it means being inconveniently powerful. You follow a defendant out into the courtyard after a not guilty verdict. He breathes a sigh of relief, slapping a friend on the back. Behind him, a slave quietly gathers the scrolls and rebinds them for storage. No celebration, just more work. Athens boasted about its isonomia, equal access to the courts, but that only applied to citizens. If you were enslaved and wronged, your only hope was your master suing on your behalf. Otherwise, silence. Or revenge if you were brave and desperate. There's a long-debated question historians love to chew on. Could a slave ever testify? The answer: kind of, but only under torture. You heard that right. In Athens, slave testimony was considered more reliable if it came with bruises. The logic: slaves wouldn't dare lie under pain. Citizens might, because they were sneaky. But slaves. Beat them hard enough, and the truth would fall out like coins from a purse. You pass a chamber where two men discuss the merits of extracting a confession from a housemaid involved in a theft. They don't talk about her age, or what she saw. Just how long it might take to get her to talk. As if she were a pot needing more fire. You want to scream, but the horror here is quiet, bureaucratic, routine. You move next to the archives, a cramped room where years of rulings, decrees, and estate inventories are piled in baskets. The air is thick with ink and mold. Two slaves shuffle between shelves, retrieving documents for the magistrate outside. One of them limps. You notice the way his shoulder is hunched, permanently crooked. Maybe a punishment. Maybe a work injury no one cared to name. He pauses for a moment, fingers brushing a scroll title. Then he moves on. These records hold the city's entire memory, but he'll never appear in them. And yet they know the system better than anyone. Every filing trick, every loop in the law, every way a name could disappear or appear at just the right moment. You wonder how much justice has been quietly guided or subverted by the hands that hold the paperwork. It's easy to say that Athens' democracy was inclusive, but here's the harder truth. It was inclusive among a slice of society, men with status, leisure, and a vote. And that inclusion depended entirely on others picking up the slack. Want a fair trial? You need scribes, need jurors fed and paid. Someone must manage the coins. Want to enforce a ruling? Someone fetches the debtor, seizes the assets, unrolls the parchment that makes it all official. Guess who? It's always the hands you don't see. You walk past a cell where a prisoner is being held for failing to pay a fine. The guard outside, also a slave. He yawns, taps a rhythm on the wall with a stick, and watches the sun crawl toward noon. No judgment, no cruelty, just the job. By mid-afternoon, the trials wrap up. Citizens pour out into the streets, debating outcomes over figs and wine. Justice was done, someone says. A fair result, nods another. Behind them, the clerks gather the tools, the scribes file the outcomes, the torches are extinguished. The machine cools until tomorrow, and as you step out into the sunlight again, you realize Athens didn't invent justice. It invented a performance of justice, dressed up in eloquence and marble, and every performance needs stagehands. You wake early today, following the smell of yeast and fire through winding alleyways to a part of Athens most tourists wouldn't dare romanticize. It's loud, it's gritty, it's real. Welcome to the industrial underbelly, the workshops, foundries, and factories that hum beneath the city's clean civic skin like a second heartbeat. You pass a smithy first. Sparks fly as a hammer clangs rhythmically against iron. You squint through the smoke and see who's wielding the tools, not the master artisan, but his enslaved apprentice, shoulders hunched, arms scorched with old burns. The master. He's sipping watered wine nearby, giving vague instructions between mouthfuls. A dog barks. A child cries. A pair of women duck into a laundry house with sloshing buckets. And all around, slaves labor in every trade you can imagine. This isn't the mythic Athens of golden dialogues and gleaming temples. This is the Athens of sweat and soot. The Athens where your sandals, roof tiles, bedsheets, and perfume all get made by hands that will never own the things they create. A fringe detail you wouldn't expect. Many Athenian craftsmen, especially the famous ones, owned skilled slaves who did most of the work. The master's name went on the vase, but the curve of the handle, the perfect balance of the base. That came from someone who never signed anything. In a pottery shop, you watch a team of slaves prepare clay. One kneads it with his feet, like dough but denser. Another shapes the first coil of what will be a massive amphora. And a third carefully paints a black figure scene of a chariot race. He's incredibly good. You wonder if he learned in captivity or brought the skill with him from a captured village. And just like that, you're staring at a paradox. Slavery and mastery existing in the same hand. It wasn't just brute labor. In Athens, enslaved people weren't always unskilled. They were everything: cobblers, weavers, furniture makers, builders, gem cutters. If it could be made, a slave probably made it. And they did it for others, always others. You pass a perfume shop where the air is thick with crushed myrrh and lavender. A slave girl stirs the oil slowly, her fingers stained yellow. It takes weeks to steep properly. Every bottle is worth a small fortune. She will never wear it. Historians still argue how much control these slaves had over their craft. Some believe they had creative autonomy, pride in their work, even a kind of internal freedom. Others insist that any expression was dictated by market demand and the master's whim. After all, art is still servitude when you don't choose your subject or price. You turn a corner and nearly trip over a pile of broken marble blocks. Nearby, 3 slaves are chiseling a sculpture under the eye of a citizen sculptor. The master's finger guides their chisel once. Then he steps back to give a speech to a client about divine proportion. The slaves keep cutting. You overhear something else. Slaves rented out for labor by the day. A citizen could hire a team of enslaved builders from another citizen, like picking tools off a shelf. There was a whole sub-economy of human rentals. No names, just rates, daily, weekly, half-day if you're in a rush. There's a phrase Athenians used casually: he's worth his weight in silver. It sounds poetic until you see it applied to people. Quirky detail time: in the dyeing district, where they make those gorgeous deep purples and reds, the process involves boiling shells, rotting fish, and fermented urine. The smell is unspeakable. The work is dangerous. You guessed it, slaves did that too. They joked darkly that the smell kept the gods away. By midday, the clamor of the city softens into the lazy lull of siesta, but the workshops don't stop. A silversmith's forge roars on. Inside, a boy no older than 12 fans the fire. Another polishes a finished bangle, eyes narrowed, hands raw. And then you see it, tucked in the shadows, almost hidden, a slave with a limp, sitting cross-legged, weaving a wicker chair. He works methodically, patiently, humming to himself. The chair is beautiful, functional. It'll go into a wealthy home where no one will ask where it came from. You realize then, this city is one big showroom of stolen talent. A gallery of what enslaved people can do under pressure, under threat, under ownership. Some enslaved artisans became so skilled that they were allowed to live independently, paying part of their wages to their owners. These technetai lived on the margins of autonomy, a kind of rented life. Freedom adjacent, but never fully free. One even saved enough to buy his freedom, only to keep working in the same workshop, because the skills he'd mastered were useless without the tools his former owner still controlled. Economic freedom, it turns out, was a matter of logistics. You end your tour of the industrial ward outside a massive tannery. The air is sharp with ammonia. Slaves move slowly, dunking hides, scraping fat. One coughs hard, doubled over. No one stops. The quota has to be met. And you think, this is the foundation, not marble, not ideals, not speeches. This. The wealth of Athens didn't just come from its silver mines, or its trade routes, or its tribute. It came from its craftspeople in chains, the workers whose names never made it into the symposium toasts. The philosophers might have debated whether art reflected truth, but the slaves knew the real truth. It was splattered on their aprons, crusted under their nails, and sold for profit on streets they built but didn't own. As twilight bleeds across the sky, you pass one last workshop. The door is open. Inside, a girl shapes clay into tiny figurines, gods mostly. Athene, Apollo, Hermes. She arranges them on a drying rack, careful, delicate. And for just a second, you wonder what it must feel like to mold a god with your hands and still not be allowed to speak your own name aloud. The sun rises on another Athenian morning, bright, golden, and deceptively clean. Today, you veer away from the markets and workshops and toward the world of the dead. Not because you're morbid, but because if you want to understand a city, look at how it buries its people and who gets buried at all. You follow a funeral procession out of town. It's not grand. Just a line of mourners in dark cloaks, a wooden bier, and a quiet rhythm of sandals against stone. As you approach the cemetery of the Kerameikos, where Athenians have laid their elite to rest for generations, something strange becomes apparent. No slaves are being buried here, at least not officially. The finest marble stelae, carved statues, engraved names, heroic poses are reserved for citizens and metics, resident foreigners with some rights. The enslaved. They mostly disappear after death, like worn sandals or broken cups. It's not that they weren't mourned, some were, deeply, even lovingly, but most were not buried with ceremony, and almost none were given names that lasted more than a season or two. When their labor ended, so did their imprint on the city's memory, and yet traces remain. In a corner of the cemetery, archaeologists found small, unnamed grave hastily dug. No inscriptions, a few modest offerings. A toy, a bead, sometimes nothing at all. Many of these were likely slaves, especially the children of slaves, who didn't even count as full persons under law. Mainstream fact. Slaves could not legally make wills, own property, or bequeath anything to their families. When they died, their bodies were disposed of by their masters or by the state if no one claimed them. Their lives ended with silence. Their deaths were a logistical task. You pause at one particular stele, unusually worn but still upright. It depicts a woman handing a child a dove, gentle, poetic, but the child is likely the woman's servant. There's no inscription to say otherwise. You wonder if the artist meant it as kindness or as a reminder of dominance. Fringe detail. Some wealthy Athenians did leave instructions in their wills to free a favorite slave upon their death. A reward, a final act of benevolence. But here's the catch. It only counted if the heirs honored it. There was no enforcement, no accountability. A good master might keep their promise, a greedy heir might not. You walk farther from the cemetery into a field where state-owned slaves sometimes buried their own. No marker, no coin on the tongue, just dirt and fading footsteps. It's not that Athenians denied death to the enslaved, it's that they denied its meaning. No legacy, no afterlife with recognition, and yet, even in the silence, stories survived. There's a legend passed quietly through generations about a slave who saved his master's children during a fire. The family honored him by burying him in their own plot, naming him as beloved companion. Was it true? Who knows? But even a whisper like that cuts through the stone. You think of all the enslaved nurses, tutors, cooks, and caretakers who might have held more of a family's heart than any cousin or in-law, and still ended their days as refuse. Historians still argue whether enslaved people could participate in religious rites for the dead. Some say yes, especially in private, domestic contexts. Others argue they were barred from sacred ceremonies. Either way, we know this. Slaves prepared the bodies, washed them, dressed them, keened over them, but no one keened for the keeners. In a small grove nearby, you see a cluster of household slaves performing libations, pouring oil and wine on a low stone. It's unofficial, quiet, maybe even forbidden, but it's a ritual, maybe for a lost friend, maybe for themselves. Quirky image, one inscription on a child's grave reads, "Beloved by all, even the cook." It's meant as a compliment to the child, but you can't help notice the hierarchy even in death. The cook is named as an accessory to love, not a person with grief. You sit for a while, letting the birdsong settle in. You imagine the conversations that must have happened in whispers between enslaved people who knew one of their own was dying. What could they do? How could they honor a life when the law said it barely counted? Maybe they sang. Maybe they buried tokens, scraps of cloth, hair, bits of carved wood. Maybe memory was their only rebellion. One exceptional case breaks through the silence. A man named Herman, a public slave who served the city as a herald for decades, was granted a state burial. A civic funeral, a rare honor, but his plaque calls him formerly a slave, as if that stain never washed away. Even death didn't fully absolve. By afternoon, you find yourself back near the city walls, watching a new grave being dug. A boy too small to be a soldier. No family in sight, just two men and a shovel. One mutters about household loss. The other shrugs, and you realize something chilling. For every citizen grave with its carved epigram and flowery remembrance, There are 10 lives unmarked, 10 stories erased, 10 souls forgotten because their labor was taken, their personhood denied, and their deaths treated as cleanup. This is where the Athenian dream comes full circle. A city that builds its glory on voices, then silences the ones who built the walls, oiled the stadiums, carved the statues, and caught the babies. They vanish when the breathing stops. But today you see them, and maybe, just maybe, that matters. The marketplace buzzes again as you step back into the heart of Athens. But today you're not looking at the goods, the sellers, or even the buyers. You're watching for something far subtler, something woven into the fabric of Athenian daily life, like dye into a chiton. Today, you're watching how slavery hides in plain sight. You head down a narrow street, past perfumers and cobblers, and pause by a stall selling wigs, luxurious, curled, imported. A woman holds one up to the light, admiring its sheen. The shopkeeper smiles politely, but he doesn't make them. He doesn't clean them. He doesn't glue them strand by strand. A slave does. You catch a glimpse of her through a back curtain, head down, fingers moving with mindless precision. She doesn't speak, doesn't pause, and she's not meant to be seen. Athens prefers its wealth to look effortless, no visible hands, and that's the trick, really. In democratic Athens, the greatest illusion is that of autonomy, of citizens being self-made, independent, purely self-governed. But all around you, the proof stacks up. Someone is always picking up the pieces, just out of frame. Take the food stalls. A cheerful vendor roasts octopus while calling out prices to passers-by. But his fire was lit by a slave an hour before sunrise. The fish was cleaned by someone who will never taste it. Even the skewers were probably carved by hand, by someone who doesn't eat meat. You remember something a philosopher once said, something like, "Freedom is living without need of another." Cute, except everyone here is absolutely dependent on the labor of the enslaved, for meals, for transport, for clean water. For everything, mainstream fact, the Athenian household, oikos, was legally and socially defined by its slaves. A house wasn't complete without at least one enslaved person. Even poor citizens aspired to own at least one, a cook, a nurse, a farmhand, not because it was a luxury, but because it was normal. Historians still argue whether slavery was seen as a moral institution or just a fact of nature. Plato and Aristotle danced around the idea, calling some people natural slaves, designed to serve. Not everyone agreed, even back then, but few dared to imagine life without them. And while some slave owners were brutal, others prided themselves on being kind. But let's be honest, a cage with cushions is still a cage. The system didn't need cruelty to function, it just needed silence. You notice a girl, maybe 10, carrying a baby down the steps of a fine house. She whispers something to calm the child. A woman, likely the mother, hands her a basket and sends her off to market. The girl nods, already knowing the list by heart. A quirky custom, Athenian slave children raised with citizen children were often used as playmates, even tutors. They grew up alongside them until the differences snapped into place. One got a wedding, the other got a dowry-less transfer to another household. You slip into a bathhouse, the steam curls like incense. Men laugh, gossip, shout across the pools. But behind the stone columns, the workers scrub floors, haul water, heat the coals, enslaved, all of them. The marble shines because someone bleeds over it. No one asks their names. Later, at a symposium, a boozy, intellectual dinner party, you observe the performance of citizen leisure in full swing. Reclining couches, flutes, storytelling, every guest is free, every server is not, and the servers, often young boys, chosen for their looks, made to pour wine, keep cups full, and sometimes more. It's not just about utility, it's about status, a subtle, grotesque display of power and ownership disguised as culture. One man tells a joke about a lazy slave who tripped and spilled wine on a guest. Everyone laughs. Another brags that his new slave, understands poetry better than my son. Laughter again, you want to scream, because the slaves laugh too. Quietly, nervously, it's part of the job, even their amusement is assigned. You slip away as the music gets louder, following a torchlit path to the edge of the city. There's a small compound there, near the river, where state-run slaves sleep. Not owned by individuals, but by Athens itself. Municipal property, shared labor, you peek in, some lie on mats. Others talk quietly, playing a game with pebbles in the dirt. One carves a little owl, the Athenian symbol, into a bit of wood. Not as a tribute, more like a private joke. Fringe detail, some of these public slaves worked in roles we'd call tech support, managing city records, weights and measures, public works. Without them, Athenian administration would grind to a halt. They were essential, but never praised. It's here, watching them relax under moonlight, that you realize Athens doesn't hide its slavery. It just absorbs it, so deeply that even citizens don't notice anymore. The system is so entrenched, so foundational, that questioning it feels like questioning the city itself. And even when a slave gains their freedom through saving money, earning a grant, or receiving a kind master's mercy, it comes with strings. Legally free, yes, but still barred from owning land, from marrying a citizen, from speaking in the assembly. Freedom, Athenian style, comes with asterisks. You return home that night with sore feet and a head full of contradictions. The city gleams in the torchlight. It looks clean, orderly, civilized, but now you know better. Athens doesn't run on democracy. It runs on a double life, public virtue powered by private control. The dream is real, but only for those standing on someone else's back. The roosters crow just as you cross the threshold of a home larger than most temples. This is no ordinary oikos. This is an Athenian elite household, and today you get the full tour, not as a guest, but as a silent observer. The courtyard is clean, impossibly clean. It smells like olive soap and laurel leaves. A small fountain gurgles in the center, its surface perfectly still. But the stillness, manufactured. Just beneath it is motion, silent feet, soft voices, the constant presence of enslaved people who make peace seem effortless. You step into the andron, the men's room, where symposia are held, where philosophy flows with wine. The cushions are fluffed, the wine jugs are polished, the lamps are trimmed. A slave boy is already lighting the first wick, eyes darting toward the doorway, checking if the master is about to enter. He doesn't speak, he doesn't stop. This is just the morning, and this home, it functions like a micro-city. Every person has a task. Many are citizens, some are metics, but most of the actual work is done by slaves, men, women, children. Some born into servitude, others purchased, others inherited like furniture. Mainstream fact, wealthy Athenian families often own dozens of slaves, with large households numbering over 50. Some were laborers, others were artisans. Many were domestic, the invisible scaffolding of upper-class life. You pass into the gyneconitis, the women's quarters. It's quiet, humming with activity. A woman embroiders while two slave girls assist her. One holds a thread between her teeth, the other fans a brazier to keep the dye warm. Neither is older than 14. Here's a quirky tidbit: elite Athenian women rarely left the house. Their public presence was frowned upon. So household slaves became their only consistent companions, confidants, and go-betweens with the outside world. This arrangement, intimate but rigid, is confusing. Some slaves nursed the mistress's children, dressed her for festivals, even shared her secrets. But any line crossed, real or imagined, could still end in punishment. Historians still debate the emotional bonds in these households. Did some mistresses feel affection for their slaves? Did slaves ever see their owners as family? The evidence is tangled. Some inscriptions hint at closeness. Others record brutality with chilling detachment. One stele from a private grave reads simply, To Thalia, my maid, who served with loyalty. Is that affection or just bookkeeping? In the kitchen, a woman stirs lentils while kneeling on stone. Her hands are blistered and her hair is covered in a damp cloth. You don't know her name. No one ever wrote it down. But everything about this house, its smells, its meals, its quiet elegance, comes from her rhythm. As you tour the storerooms, you see slaves managing the inventory, grain, oil, dried fish, fine imported spices. A boy barely up to your shoulder tallies weights on a wax tablet. His handwriting is perfect. That's the thing about domestic slavery in Athens. It wasn't just servitude, it was surveillance. These slaves knew every quarrel in the family, every shift in mood, every careless word spoken after wine. They were always watching, but never allowed to speak. You spot a man with graying hair adjusting a child's cradle. He moves gently with care. Is he the boy's tutor, the nurse, a household elder? No, just a longtime slave, possibly born in the house. His touch is full of memory, but legally he has no kin, no future, not even a last name. There's another slave you meet, a doorman called a thuororos. He guards the entrance, screens visitors, maintains the household schedule. The irony is sharp. He controls who enters and who leaves, but he can't leave himself. Outside, the master is giving instructions to a messenger, another slave. He's preparing to go to the agora with a list of errands, fetch a cloak, deliver a letter, refill the oil jug, inquire about a dinner guest's availability. He'll walk miles before lunch, and still he's considered lucky. Why? Because at least he gets to see sunlight. Athenians believed that domestic slaves were better off than mine workers or field hands. And in some ways, they were no constant fear of cave-ins, no back-breaking loads. But comfort is a fragile shield when freedom is never on the menu. At lunch, the family eats on cushioned couches. Slaves serve dishes in silence. The children chatter. The father asks his wife to play a tune on the lyre. She declines. He asks again, she plays. He smiles. You think every moment here is choreographed by invisible labor. The food is warm, the water is cool, the air doesn't smell of sweat because someone swept before you arrived. You notice something else. Slaves don't eat with the family, they eat later and less. If food is left over, they sleep on mats, on stone floors, in storage rooms. Some don't even get a roof. But even this division isn't consistent. In some homes, trust was essential. A cook who could poison a dish, a tutor who could twist a child's words, a doorman who could let in thieves. So, a strange tension hung in the air, dependence coated in suspicion. That's what makes Athenian domestic slavery unique. Not the whips, which were real, or the hierarchy, which was strict, but the closeness, the way these human beings lived in the same space, breathed the same air, shared the same fire, and remained completely unequal. You pass back into the courtyard as dusk falls. The torches are lit. The master reclines again, dictating a letter to a scribe. Another slave brings wine. Another tunes the flute. The city outside winds down, but the house remains alive. Its rhythm set not by clocks, but by expectation. And the ones who keep it running, they won't appear in any family tree, but without them, the tree never would have grown. The moon rises, but your night's not over. Tonight, you step into the shadows, because while Athens likes to present itself as a city of rational thought and open debate, it's also a city of secrets, of torches flickering in alleys, whispered oaths, and rituals whispered behind closed doors. And yes, slaves are there too. Your feet carry you to the edges of the Acropolis, where the air gets cooler and the chatter fades. A small procession is moving toward the sanctuary of Demeter at Eleusis. They walk in silence, bearing torches, faces solemn. You stay just far enough behind to observe without intruding. They're preparing for the Eleusinian mysteries, sacred rites that promised participants a better fate in the afterlife. The rituals are famously secret. Even today, historians debate what exactly went on during the final ceremonies. But here's what's clear. Initiation was reserved for those who spoke Greek, and slaves were sometimes included. Yes, included. Unlike most religious spaces in Athens, the mysteries were strangely democratic. Men, women, metics, even slaves, anyone not guilty of murder could be initiated. Why? Some say the gods didn't care about social status, only piety. Others think it was a clever way to unify society through shared experience. Still, the experience wasn't equal. A citizen walked through the sacred telesterion with pride. A slave walked behind. The same ritual, a different gaze. You pass a man in a white robe murmuring a hymn. His slave stands nearby, holding the sacrificial basket. He's part of the ceremony, but not the spirit of it. Always adjacent, never central. Mainstream fact: slaves were prohibited from most civic religious functions, especially those tied to citizenship. They couldn't participate in city festivals like the Parthenon as equals, and their presence was often limited to logistical roles, setting up, tearing down, preparing offerings. They made the rituals possible, but rarely sacred. And yet privately, religion was woven into their lives. You duck into a tiny shrine tucked between two houses. Inside, a clay figurine of Hecate watches from a corner shelf. 3 candles burn. A slave girl kneels, whispering something into the dark. Her hands shake. She's praying not for victory or glory, but maybe for safety, or strength, or escape. This was the other Athens. The one not etched in marble, but whispered in kitchens and stables. Slaves clung to gods with the same desperation as citizens, but often with different expectations. They weren't asking to win wars. They were asking to survive another week. You pass a row of altars in the Agora: Zeus, Athene, Hermes. During festivals, slaves are expected to serve, preparing feasts, cleaning up blood from sacrifices, fetching garlands. But they also sometimes made their own small offerings. Coins, hair, scraps of food, quiet hopes left where no one would see. A quirky practice: some slave women would bury tiny tokens, shells, beads, even fingernail clippings, as private spells. Protection charms, fertility prayers, love magic. Nothing official, nothing recognized, but powerful in their own hidden way. You follow the scent of incense to a wealthy home's courtyard, where a dinner party has just ended. A poet is performing his last lines. "The gods favor the just," he says, and everyone applauds. Behind him, a slave clears the plates. Historians still argue whether enslaved people were considered spiritually inferior or just socially excluded. Some scholars insist religion was a tool of control, used to teach slaves to accept their fate. Others argue it was a tool of resistance, a source of inner freedom when no outer freedom existed. You feel the tension in every gesture. A temple guarded by free men, swept by enslaved women. A procession that lets slaves join but never lead. A belief in divine justice held by people trapped in legal injustice. The contradictions stack higher than the Parthenon. Later you pass the temple of Asclepius, god of healing. Inside, sick people sleep on mats, hoping for divine dreams. Slaves are here too, some sick, some caring for the sick. They prepare herbs, change bandages, wash wounds. One young man, clearly enslaved, sits beside a patient, humming a tune. His master lies dying. The slave stays up all night, holding a cold cloth to his forehead. And you think, in this moment, who's the more virtuous soul? As dawn approaches, you wind through the back alleys near the harbor. There's a woman at a small crossroads altar, pouring oil onto a stone. She wears simple clothes, no jewelry, a slave likely. She bows her head, whispers something, and walks away. You don't hear the words, but they don't have to be loud to be real. Religion in Athens was supposed to elevate, to unify, to connect the city with the divine. But in practice, it mirrored the society around it, hierarchical, controlled, exclusionary. And yet, within those rigid walls, enslaved people carved out moments of belief, of hope, of invisible dignity. You end the night at the temple of Athene, watching the sun creep up behind the columns. Citizens will come soon, with polished sandals and loud prayers. They'll ask for victory, honor, glory. But somewhere, in a darker corner of the city, someone else will whisper a smaller prayer, one that might never be recorded, but might be remembered. Because when the gods listen, they don't always need titles. The sky hangs heavy, tinted peach and gold, as the Athenian day winds down for the final time on your journey. But you're not resting yet, not while the gears of the city are still turning. Not while one last machine still clinks, clicks, and crushes beneath its smooth marble surface. Tonight, you descend into the silver mines of Laurion. It's a long way from the grandeur of the Acropolis. Here, the air tastes like iron and salt. The trees grow sparse, and the birds, they don't sing here. Even nature seems to hold its breath. These mines, the dark, suffocating lungs of Athenian wealth, are where the city gets the silver to mint its famous drachmas, to pay its jurors, to fund its navy, to build the Parthenon, and the workers, slaves, thousands of them. You reach the mouth of a narrow shaft, no taller than a crouched man. The walls are slick, the air is hot, the light is gone after the first 5 steps. No torches, just oil lamps. And boys, lots of boys, many no older than 9 or 10, naked except for loincloths, crawling into tunnels the width of your shoulders. They carry baskets, one way full of stone, the other empty. They don't speak. They don't cry, they just move. Mainstream fact: Athens enslaved tens of thousands of people for mining. Many were foreign captives. Others were born into slavery. Most never made it past their 20s. Lung disease, cave-ins, starvation. No labor in Athens was more feared or more forgotten. A fringe detail to chill your blood. Archaeologists found finger bones embedded in collapsed shafts, too small to belong to adults. Evidence of children crushed where they worked, never recovered. One boy brushes past you, eyes blank, mouth dry. He clutches a hammer so tightly you think it might be part of him. His world is 10 feet wide. He has never seen the sea. Above ground, a slave operates a winch to haul buckets. His arms are like ropes. He's blind in one eye. You don't ask what happened. You don't need to. Historians still argue how many lives were spent for each talent of silver extracted. Some say dozens, others say hundreds. And for what? The shimmering coins in an agora purse, a polished helmet, a new play performed on festival night, the city's glory. But glory has a smell, and it reeks of sweat, blood, and stone dust. You walk deeper into the warren of shafts. It's eerily quiet, no voices, just the occasional clink of a pickaxe. No birds, no wind, just breath and stone and death. This isn't slavery you can dress up. There are no marble floors or perfumed feasts. No benevolent masters reading poetry in the background. This is slavery stripped bare, raw, industrial, disposable. One man, barely a man, collapses in front of you. A supervisor yells. No one stops. Another slave drags him aside. The tunnel narrows. Work continues. You see the mine's smelting area, a furnace belching smoke, a stinging stink of chemicals. Slaves feed it constantly, throwing in crushed ore, hauling out molten silver like it's just firewood. A quirky tidbit: some slaves were punished by being sent to the mines. Meaning, if you were already enslaved, there was still a way to fall lower. The mines weren't just a workplace, they were a sentence. You step back into the daylight, blinking hard. Your skin feels dusty, your lungs ache. You spent an hour. They spend lifetimes. And the wealth that pays for democracy, it sparkles in the counting houses of Athens. You pass one such office on your return. A citizen counts drachmas, weighing silver on a fine scale. A ledger keeper, likely a freedman, records the weight. They smile. Business is good. No mention of where the silver came from or who gave their life for it. You begin to see the city differently. Not as a marvel, but as a machine with beautiful skin. The architecture, the rhetoric, the democratic rituals, all gleaming surfaces, but beneath, a dark engine of human lives burning slowly, you return to the agora. Someone is giving a speech about justice. Another is selling olives. A group of children plays with clay dolls. The city hums along as if its bones aren't buried with the enslaved. You sit on a stone bench. You watch. You think. And slowly you let it all settle. Because Athens was never just a tale of genius and glory. It was also a tale of chains, of brilliance bought with suffering, freedom built on backs, and choices made without conscience. And the brutal truth, you can love Athens, you can admire it, but you can't romanticize it, not anymore. Now the city fades, the torches flicker low, the echo of sandals on stone grows faint. The voices that argued and laughed and ruled sink beneath the hush of night. You lie back, letting the dark cradle your thoughts. The weight of what you've seen settles softly over you, like dust on a shelf no one touches anymore. You can still feel the heat of the forge, the damp of the mines, the ache behind the silent glance of a house servant adjusting a cushion. There's a quiet dignity in remembering them, those whose names never reached marble, whose stories were never sung at symposia. The boy in the mine, the girl at the loom, the cook who never tasted the honeyed lamb he roasted. They made the city, they were the city, and while Athens whispered ideals about freedom, they whispered something else. Resilience, memory. Hope held quietly in calloused hands. Let your breath slow now. Let your mind drift, not away from the truth, but through it gently. The city rests. Its shadows stretch long. Its light, like yours, dims softly. And the stories you now carry, quiet, invisible, real, tuck themselves into the folds of sleep. Sweet dreams, historian.